She disappeared just as the headline started circling again. No warning, no statement. One moment she was smiling at her granddaughter's christening in London, and the next she was gone. Not on vacation, not on a quiet countryside retreat. She checked into one of the most expensive mental health clinics in the world, a Swiss facility that costs up to £13,000 a day. The timing raised eyebrows, because just days before, resurfaced documents had dragged her name back into a controversy many thought had faded. Old emails, old connections, old questions, and suddenly the past didn't feel so distant anymore. Was this a woman overwhelmed by relentless scrutiny, or was this a strategic retreat before things escalated further? Today, we're breaking down what really happened, why Zurich became her refuge, and why this story is far from over. If you want clear, no-fluff breakdowns of stories the headlines don't fully explain, make sure to subscribe, because some narratives don't disappear, they just go quiet. This wasn't a quiet spa weekend. She checked into Paracelsus Recovery, a lakeside clinic in Zurich, known less for yoga mats and more for absolute privacy, the kind of place where discretion is part of the treatment plan, where clients arrive quietly and leave even quieter. The price alone makes a statement, around £110,000 for a 3-day assessment, up to £350,000 for a month-long residential stay, a private chauffeur on standby, a personal chef, a team of specialists focused on addiction, burnout, anxiety, trauma, 15 medical experts behind closed doors. It's not designed for tourists, it's designed for people who need to disappear. And this wasn't her first time there. She had previously spoken about finding sanctuary within those walls. It was there she said she was diagnosed with PTSD and ADHD. She even appeared in promotional material for the clinic, praising its discretion and high-level care. So when pressure mounted again, Zurich wasn't random. It was familiar, controlled, shielded. But familiarity doesn't answer the real question. Why did she feel the need to return now?
The spark wasn't new. It was old, but it came back louder. Fresh waves of Epstein-related documents began circulating again, and buried inside were email exchanges that pulled her name back into the conversation. Not explosive revelations, not courtroom drama, just reminders, and sometimes reminders are enough. The emails showed she had stayed in contact after his conviction. They referenced financial strain, requests for help, a visit that raised eyebrows. For many people, this was history. For the internet, it was unfinished business. Commentary reignited overnight, feeds filled with screenshots and side-by-side timelines. Old judgments resurfaced with new intensity, and according to reports, she was absolutely crushed as the scrutiny returned. The story didn't need new accusations to sting, it only needed visibility. But the backlash wasn't just about emails. Critics quickly pointed to something else, a contradiction that made the situation even harder to ignore. Money has followed her story for years. Long before this latest wave of headlines, she had been open about struggling with debt, business ventures that didn't go as planned, public embarrassment tied to finances, moments that chipped away at credibility. It wasn't a secret, it was documented. But here's where the tension sharpens. In those resurfaced emails, there were references to financial pressure, requests for assistance, conversations that suggested she wasn't on solid ground at the time. And that's what made the next move so jarring, because when scrutiny returned, she didn't retreat somewhere modest or low profile. She entered one of the most expensive recovery clinics in Europe, a place that can cost more in a month than many people earn in years. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. On one side, a history of financial strain. On the other, a £350,000 sanctuary in Switzerland. So where did the funding come from? Supporters argue that health comes first, especially mental health. That when someone feels overwhelmed, the cost shouldn't matter. And to them, this wasn't about luxury. It was about stability. But critics weren't convinced. They questioned the optics, they questioned the timing, and they questioned whether the retreat was purely personal or partially strategic. Because here's the uncomfortable part. Public image and financial narrative have always been intertwined in her story. Every setback seemed to resurface during moments of controversy. Every recovery seemed to come just as pressure peaked. Coincidence? Maybe, but the pattern is hard to ignore. And just as the debate over money began to grow louder, another shadow loomed over the situation, one that made this episode even more complicated.
Her story has never existed in isolation. No matter how independent her public persona became, she remained tied to one of the most scrutinized institutions in the world. And when controversy circles that orbit, everyone connected feels the pull. This time was no different. The Epstein scandal didn't just damage individual reputations, it shook public trust on a much larger scale. Associations were dissected, timelines were re-examined, old photographs resurfaced, and even those no longer holding official roles found themselves pulled back into the spotlight. And that's where things get heavier, because proximity matters. Even years after a separation, even after titles are gone, the public rarely separates the individuals from the history. To many observers, it's all part of the same chapter, which means when scrutiny intensifies, distance doesn't always protect you. Behind palace gates, the strategy has often been silence, minimal comment, controlled appearances, let the storm pass. But what happens when the storm keeps coming back? Each new document release, each renewed headline, each online debate, it reopens questions that never fully closed. And for someone who has spent decades trying to rebuild credibility, that repetition can feel relentless. But here's the deeper tension. Is the pressure coming from the public or from the weight of legacy itself? Because when your name is permanently linked to controversy, even indirectly, stepping away doesn't always mean stepping free. And just when it seemed like retreating to Switzerland might quiet the noise, the reaction outside those clinic walls started growing louder.
Here's the question no one can seem to agree on. Was this a woman protecting her mental health or protecting her image? She has spoken openly about trauma before, about being diagnosed with PTSD, about living with ADHD, about the toll of public life. None of that is new, and for supporters, that history makes the clinic stay understandable. When pressure spikes, you return to what feels safe. But the timing complicates everything. Because she didn't disappear during a quiet season, she left just as scrutiny reignited, just as screenshots spread, just as conversations intensified online. That's what keeps the debate alive. Some argue that stepping away was the healthiest possible response, that removing herself from the spotlight prevented further damage, that choosing treatment over public defense shows growth. But others see it differently. They question whether the retreat created distance at a crucial moment, whether silence allowed the headlines to move on faster, whether Zurich offered more than therapy, whether it offered strategic pause. And that tension is what makes this story stick. In today's digital world, scandals don't fade, they cycle. Documents resurface, conversations reignite, and reputations are never fully rebuilt, only managed. So maybe the clinic wasn't just a sanctuary. Maybe it was a shield. Or maybe it was both. Because when your past can reappear with a single document drop, the real challenge isn't escaping the noise, it's surviving it. In the end, this wasn't just about a trip to Zurich. It was about timing. A public reappearance, a resurfaced controversy, a sudden retreat to one of the most exclusive recovery clinics in the world. The sequence alone was enough to spark questions, and in today's climate, questions spread faster than answers. She says the clinic offers sanctuary, a place free from judgment, a place to heal, and after decades in the spotlight, few would argue that the pressure hasn't been real. But public memory is long. Old emails don't disappear, associations don't fade overnight. And when documents resurface years later, they don't just reopen headlines, they reopen perception. That's the real battle here. Not just mental health, not just reputation, but the tension between vulnerability and accountability, between privacy and public curiosity, between stepping away and appearing to step back at just the right moment. So was this a necessary reset, or a carefully timed pause? Maybe we'll never fully know, but one thing is certain. In a world where nothing truly vanishes, disappearing is sometimes the loudest move of all. If you found this breakdown clear and straight to the point, make sure to subscribe. We cover the stories that resurface when you least expect them, and the details most headlines leave out. Because some narratives don't end, they just wait for the next release.